The early afternoon light over the airfield at Rechlin on the 9th of November, 1943, was thin and brittle, the kind of northern German daylight that never warmed the ground even at its brightest hour. A layer of frost clung to the grass between the concrete strips, and the winter air carried the faint metallic smell of cold machinery. Ground crews moved with purposeful restraint, their wool collars turned up against the wind as they worked to position a newly arrived aircraft inside Hangar 8. It sat there under the dim overhead lamps, a hulking, unfamiliar shape whose proportions violated every instinct that German fighter design had cultivated for a decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Two mechanics had already climbed onto the wing, their boots thumping softly on aluminum panels that were noticeably thicker than what they were used to. A third man stood on the ground with a clipboard, watching as one of the workers pulled open a wide cockpit door, the way one might open a cellar hatch. A wave of cold air escaped from the cabin, carrying with it the faint scent of leather upholstery, hydraulic fluid, and engine oil refined to a standard the Germans rarely saw anymore. The aircraft's skin was still painted in American olive drab. The Balkenkreuz had been applied hastily, leaving faint overspray on the fuselage. The cockpit interior, even in the bad lighting, was unmistakably foreign. The gauges were large, clear, spaced far apart. The seat sat deep and broad, and the canopy rails slid with a smoothness that made one mechanic mutter under his breath. But none of them said much. They had worked around captured machines before Spitfires, P-40s, the occasional Soviet Laji, but this one felt different. The men were quiet because they sensed the significance of the object in front of them, even if they did not yet understand it. Their commanding officer stepped inside the hangar at that moment, boots echoing against the concrete. He paused only long enough to brush frost from his coat sleeve before signalling the men to step aside. Behind him came the test pilot assigned to fly the aircraft. Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lersche, 30 years old, lean from years of flight work, his gloved hands tucked behind his back as he studied the shape of the machine in front of him. He did not approach immediately. He simply stood there, absorbing its silhouette broad wings, a massive radial engine, a cockpit set high above the fuselage like a watchtower. He had flown more than 120 types of aircraft by that point in the war, from the heaviest British bombers to the lightest Soviet fighters. Nothing about an unfamiliar cockpit frightened him anymore, but something in the proportions of this American Thunderbolt demanded his full attention. He waited a long moment before walking forward and mounting the wing. The mechanic nearest the cockpit stepped aside. Lersche reached for the open canopy rail, bracing himself against the cold metal before lowering his head to look inside. And it was at that precise moment, before he even sat down, before the aircraft was repainted, before any engine run or high-altitude climb, that he understood, instinctively and without needing any briefing documents, that the Luftwaffe had underestimated this machine from the start. What he saw did not resemble the cramped, minimalist, weight-saving interiors of German fighters. It was something different, something that revealed an engineering philosophy he had only glimpsed in fragments before. The cockpit looked less like a fighter and more like a workplace designed for endurance, reliability, and long-range performance, things German doctrine rarely prioritized. The Thunderbolt had been dragged into the hangar only hours earlier, arriving from a railcar after its unexpected landing in a French field near Caen on the 7th of November, 1943. The American pilot, Second Lieutenant William Roach, of the 358th Fighter Squadron, had believed he was descending onto English soil after losing his bearings in heavy cloud and watching his fuel gauge sink toward empty. Instead, he had taxied to a stop surrounded by Wehrmacht troops. The aircraft had been captured intact, no fire damage, no structural fractures, no sabotage, the kind of prize the Luftwaffe had long hoped for. Roach's mistake had set off a chain of activity within German aviation circles. The Reich Air Ministry had ordered the aircraft moved to Rechlin immediately. There, in this cold hangar, it now rested under dim lighting, awaiting its first German evaluation. Rechlin's command staff needed answers. Reports from frontline units had already suggested that the American escort fighters, appearing alongside the B-17 and B-24, formations flew higher, faster, and for longer periods than the combat principles taught in Luftwaffe flight schools ever anticipated. Something was changing in the skies over Europe, and the Germans needed to understand what. For years, German fighter doctrine had been refined around speed, agility, and short-range interception. Aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 embodied those principles: lightweight airframes, compact cockpits, single-purpose engines built for sprinting rather than endurance. The fighters took off, climbed rapidly, struck bomber formations or their escorts, and returned to base within an hour or less. The system worked well in the early stages of the air war, when the Luftwaffe could concentrate fighters close to industrial targets and fuel supplies were still sufficient. But that philosophy was being tested. American heavy bombers were pushing deeper into German airspace than ever before, sometimes flying all the way to the Ruhr, Hamburg, or Bremen, and returning without suffering the catastrophic losses that German planners expected. The arrival of long-range escorts, first the P-38 Lightning and then the even more formidable P-47 Thunderbolt, complicated everything further. German pilots had reported engagements at altitudes beyond the typical operational ceiling of their own machines. Many claimed the American fighters climbed more steadily above 7,000 meters and dove with alarming stability at very high speeds. Some dismissed the reports as exaggerations or excuses from inexperienced pilots. Others believed the Americans must have developed some new tactic they had not yet deciphered. The truth was more fundamental. The machines themselves were different by design. The Thunderbolt that sat before Lersch that afternoon embodied this difference. Its Pratt & Whitney double Wasp radial engine displaced far more volume than any German inline power plant. Its turbo supercharger plumbing ran through the entire fuselage, feeding compressed air back into the engine even at extreme altitudes. Its wings were thick and robust and mounted 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, each with hundreds of rounds. Its empty weight surpassed the total loaded weight of many German fighters. And yet, the American designers had not treated this as a disadvantage. They had built an aircraft capable of rising above 30,000 feet, diving like a stone without losing control, and escorting bombers to the edge of the continent and back. These were unfamiliar priorities to German engineers. The Luftwaffe had built interception machines for a continental battlefield. The Americans had built strategic tools for a global war. But none of that was articulated aloud in the hangar. Instead, there was only the sound of boots on metal as Lersch stepped down into the cockpit and settled into the deep seat, placing his gloved hands on the controls. The stick felt heavier, the throttle quadrant sturdier, the panel broader than anything he had flown from domestic factories. There were redundant controls, clear placards, wide spacing, and gauges designed to be read even in turbulence. It looked less elegant than German layouts, but it also looked survivable, designed for long hours in the air rather than short bursts of combat. A mechanic leaned in from the wing root and handed him a small notebook containing observations collected during the aircraft's recovery. Lersch did not open it. He continued studying the cockpit, noticing the trim wheels, the electrical switches, the oxygen equipment rated for very high altitudes, and the heavy armor plate mounted behind the pilot's seat. There was a confidence to the construction, a sense that the engineers had assumed their pilots would face long-range fire, high-velocity dives, and brutal weather. German fighters had armor as well, but the distribution felt different here, as though the Americans expected to preserve the pilot at nearly any cost. Outside the cockpit, the ground crew waited quietly. They had seen Lersch inspect dozens of unfamiliar aircraft before. They knew what came next: a detailed exterior examination, engine run-ups, notes to be typed at the intelligence office later that day. What they did not know was that the impression forming in the pilot's mind at that moment was not about the individual machine, but about the system that had produced it. He climbed out, landing lightly on the wing. The cold air met him again as he took a slow walk around the aircraft, placing one hand on the cowl, another on the thick wing root, squatting occasionally to study the landing gear and its shock-absorbing struts. Every part hinted at immense structural strength. The propeller blades were broader than those on any German single-engine fighter. The main gear legs had a travel distance nearly twice that of a Bf-109. Even the access panels, secured with large fasteners, suggested an expectation of routine maintenance under field conditions. He paused beneath the tail, exhaling a long cloud of vapor into the cold air. Anyone observing him might have assumed he was simply assessing the rudder or elevator linkage. But in truth, he was thinking about the larger implications. If this aircraft represented the standard escort fighter now operating against Germany, then the assumptions underpinning Luftwaffe tactics would need to be reconsidered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. This was the foundation of the belief structure that had guided German fighter operations until that moment. It was a belief in maneuverability over mass, in strategic proximity rather than range, in concentrated bursts of fighting rather than prolonged endurance. And that belief had shaped everything: pilot training, aircraft development, even fuel allocation policies. But here, in this cold hangar, that worldview was beginning to crack. Outside, a truck backfired as it moved toward another hangar, and the distant rumble echoed across the frozen airfield. Inside, Lerche placed his hands on his hips and looked once more at the machine. He had not yet flown it. He had not even started the engine. But the cockpit alone had shown him something unsettling. The Americans were designing machines for a different kind of war. And it was a kind of war that Germany was increasingly unprepared to fight. The afternoon light had faded further by the time he finished his initial inspection. The mechanics closed the canopy gently, mindful of its weight, and began preparing the aircraft for the next day's engine tests. Lerche signed the preliminary paperwork with a small pencil, his handwriting tight and efficient. Then he stepped outside into the cold wind, pulling his coat collar higher around his neck. The sun was sinking behind the pine, trees beyond the airfield boundary, casting long shadows across the concrete. He walked slowly toward the officers' barracks, the cold biting at his face. And as he crossed the open ground, he found himself replaying that first moment in the cockpit, the spacious cabin, the rugged controls, the altitude equipment, the heavy structural reinforcements. All of it pointed toward a single conclusion he was not yet ready to articulate aloud. But the thought had taken root. This machine had been built for a war Germany could no longer control. The airfield felt different the next morning, nothing dramatic at first glance, just a subtle change in atmosphere, as if everyone had unconsciously begun speaking half an octave lower. Mechanics moved with hurried efficiency, officers walked with clipped purpose, and every few minutes, someone's eyes drifted toward the far end of the field where the captured Thunderbolt sat under guard. Even men who had no business being anywhere near that hangar found excuses to pass by it. I tried to behave as though my routine had not been altered in the slightest, but there was no denying it. Something about those 3 minutes the previous evening, standing alone with the machine, touching its unfamiliar shapes, smelling the burnt sweetness of American fuel had lodged itself in my mind. I had slept in fragments, waking to indistinct impressions of curved armor plates and incomprehensible panel arrangements, as though the aircraft had followed me into my dreams. After morning briefing, Major Weber summoned me in the neutral tone he reserved for orders that were already decided. His office smelled of stale coffee and engine oil. He gestured for me to close the door, then leaned back in his chair with a sigh that hinted at how little control any of us had over the broader direction of the war. "You'll conduct a ground evaluation today," he said. "Full systems check, range of motion tests, record anything unusual, engineering teams, want observations before they start taking panels off." It wasn't a request. I nodded, though my pulse quickened a fraction. A ground evaluation meant time, real time in and around the cockpit. It meant the aircraft would no longer be a rumor or a curiosity. I would have to understand it. "Be methodical," Weber added, "and discreet. Command wants no excitement over this." That last part was almost amusing. considering half the base already walked around with necks craned toward the hangar like village children hoping to glimpse a traveling circus animal. The guards let me through without ceremony. Inside, the large space smelled of cold metal, dried mud, and the stubborn tang of American hydraulic fluid, sharper than what we used in our Focke-Wulfs. The P-47 sat where I'd left it, except more mechanics had gathered around it now. 2 were under the fuselage, tapping on something with screwdrivers. Another stood on a ladder beside the engine, cowling, muttering under his breath as he inspected a row of tightly packed fasteners. When they saw me, their conversations trailed off into respectful silence. A few nodded. One offered a thin smile, but most simply stared at the aircraft with the expression of men who weren't sure whether they were looking at a stroke of luck or a harbinger of trouble. I approached from the left side this time. The sheer bulk of the machine was even more striking in daylight. It didn't look like something that should fly, not in the way our fighters flew, with their clean lines and predatory posture. The Thunderbolt looked like a clenched fist built around a single overpowering principle: survive anything, deliver everything. "Lieutenant," one of the mechanics said, wiping his hands on a rag. "We tightened the lock on the canopy rails. It slides properly now. Might still stick in cold weather." I acknowledged him, then climbed the built-in steps with a slow, deliberate pace. The cockpit rim met my ribs. Even, stationary. The machine radiated presence, as though it occupied more space than its physical dimensions allowed. When I lowered myself inside, the seat caught me with a solidity that made my own aircraft's cockpit feel almost fragile by comparison. Everything was thicker armor, thicker frames, thicker levers. The Americans seemed to distrust the concept of just enough strength, and instead chose to engineer more than necessary wherever they could fit it. The first task was to conduct a simple ergonomics assessment. In truth, I had already begun this the previous evening without admitting it to myself. But now I had time to do it properly. The visibility over the nose was poor, absolutely terrible on the ground, practically a wall of engine and cowling. Any takeoff or landing in this machine would require exaggerated S-turns, perhaps even more extreme than in our 190 seconds. And yet, once I leaned slightly to the side and looked over the wing, I realized something unsettling. The cockpit felt higher off the ground. The pilot sat as though above the battlefield, not within it. My fingers traced the throttle quadrant, the pitch lever, and the propeller control. The resistance of the handles felt heavier, more deliberate. The Americans either had different design preferences or expected their pilots to have stronger forearms. Or perhaps they simply favored controls that would not shift under vibration. I checked the rudder pedals. They were broad and smooth, with an unusual set of springs that provided a firmer, more progressive pressure compared to our own. It would make fine yaw corrections easier, though at the cost of requiring more force during aggressive maneuvers. Everything continued like that, small discoveries that didn't seem important in isolation but added up to something I couldn't yet articulate. A clipboard rested on my knee. I made notes in terse, abbreviated German. Heavy controls, robust bearings, good switch spacing, poor forward visibility, wide pedal action, unusual fuselage resonance, even when cold. At one point I ran a hand along the left interior wall, where a row of circuit breakers sat in a neat, logical line. That alone impressed me. On our fighters, electrical systems often felt like afterthoughts, functional, yes, but never pleasant to manage. Here, the arrangement suggested someone had thought about the pilot's hands, the rhythm of combat, the speed of troubleshooting. I didn't like conceding admiration, but it was impossible not to. For nearly an hour I remained inside, alternately noting, adjusting, and simply studying. The more I looked, the more the machine revealed patterns. It wasn't beautiful, not in the way we Germans loved beauty in engineering. It was purposeful, efficient, a collection of thousands of decisions all pointing toward durability and pilot survivability. Eventually I climbed out, jotting the final line of notes, but instead of leaving the hangar, I walked a slow circle around the aircraft. I wanted to understand the shape as a whole. When I reached the engine, a mechanic was removing an access panel, revealing the densely packed radial power plant. The jug-like cylinders radiated outward in a tight circle. I leaned closer, examining the intercooler plumbing and the robust ignition harnesses. The mechanic glanced at me. "We ran numbers off the plate," he said. 14 cylinders, nearly twice the displacement of your 190, and still room left in the cowling for everything else." He sounded irritated, as though the engine had offended him personally. "Can it be started?" I asked. "Not yet," he replied. "Fuel needs filtering, and we're still arguing over whether to bypass their boost regulator. It's unconventional." That last word was doing a great deal of work. I moved toward the tail. The vertical stabilizer was larger than ours, with an almost agricultural sturdiness. The control surfaces felt heavy even when moved, by hand. It must have required substantial input in combat, yet would provide remarkable stability in high-speed dives. A thought formed, quiet and unwelcome. This aircraft was not built around the idea of nimble engagements. It was built to punish mistakes hours. After midday, a messenger found me in the hangar with a note from Weber. I was to attend a technical briefing with the engineering team. They had begun logging measurements and needed a pilot's interpretation. The briefing room was a converted mess hall. Maps of the Western Front hung along one wall, diagrams of Allied aircraft lined another. 3 engineers sat at a long table crowded with notebooks, rulers, slide rules, and coffee-stained papers filled with hastily drawn cross-sections. One of them, a senior engineer named Dr. Keller, motioned for me to sit. "We have preliminary observations," he began, rubbing his eyes, "but no conclusions. That will take time." He tapped the table. "Still, some things are already evident." He unfolded a sheet showing wing profiles. "First, structural integrity. The wing spars are thicker than anything on our fighters, stronger by a considerable margin. This aircraft was designed to withstand violent maneuvering and high-speed dives repeatedly." I nodded slowly. I had felt that even before seeing the diagrams. "Second, fuel systems." He pointed to another sketch. "The Americans use extensive self-sealing tanks, generous armor around them too. More than generous, in fact. Wasteful, by our standards." "Does it slow the aircraft?" I asked. "Of course," Keller replied. "All that protection adds weight, but they compensated with raw power." Another engineer, a younger man with oil stains on his sleeves, slid a sheet toward me. "The engines they use," he said quietly, "can handle abuse. More than our radials. Not more refined, just unbelievably tolerant of damage." That word again. Damage. As though the aircraft assumed it would take hits. Keller continued. "And then there is something else, something we still don't fully comprehend." He lifted a single-page chart showing combined flight performance ranges American estimates based on intelligence intercepts. The operating altitudes, fuel reserves, and endurance numbers seemed exaggerated. Except they weren't. "We confirmed this with the aircraft's own gauges," Keller said. "It can fly farther than our fighters, much farther." That stirred something unpleasant in my chest. Range is not simply a statistic. It is a tactical shape, a strategic boundary. Range decides who chooses the battlefield. Keller leaned back in his chair, glasses slipping down his nose. "The Americans built a fighter that trades elegance for brute practicality. It doesn't need to be the fastest in a dive or the quickest in a climb. It just has to survive, deliver firepower, and return home." "And the pilots?" I asked. "How easily could they operate? All this?" His answer came immediately. "Almost too easily." The meeting ended with a stack of documents placed into my hands. Measurements, weight estimates, cockpit diagrams, cooling system sketches. I was to review them before the next phase of evaluation. As I left the room, voices trailed behind me, engineers continuing to debate structural choices, airflow efficiencies, material costs. But their words blended into the same soft background noise I had lived with since the war began. What remained in my mind was a single, persistent impression. A machine built differently than ours at the foundational level. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip. Shadows stretched long across the airfield. Men drifted toward evening duties, cookhouses, or the first quiet moments of rest. Yet beneath the routine lay an unspoken awareness that something on this base was altering our assumptions. I felt it most acutely on my walk back to the hangar. The wind carried the faint metallic scent of fuel and the brittle bite of cooling engines. Each step seemed to echo slightly longer than it should. Inside, the P-47 stood alone again. The mechanics had packed up for the evening. The last rays of daylight brushed across its silver and olive skin. For a moment I simply stood there, saying nothing, thinking nothing, just looking. It had the presence of something inevitable. I approached the left wing and rested my hand on it, feeling the cold of the metal spread into my palm. The war until now had been a constant balance of advantage and exploitation, our strengths against theirs, our machines against theirs. But this aircraft disrupted that balance in a subtle way, not by outclassing us in a single category, but by refusing to lose where losing usually begins. And although I did not say it aloud, a quiet certainty took root in the back of my mind. If this was merely one aircraft, captured by chance, then there were hundreds more like it. Thousands, perhaps. The realization had, not yet fully formed, but it was coming. And I felt, for the first time, that we might be standing at the edge of an answer we would not like. The next morning arrived before I was ready for it. I had barely slept again. My mind kept returning to the diagrams Keller had handed me, particularly the fuel system chart. I'd stared at it in my bunk longer than I should have. The numbers didn't feel like numbers. They felt like an approaching shadow stretching across the war. When I stepped outside, the air was cool and sharp, the kind that wakes every nerve in the skin. A distant engine sputtered to life somewhere near the dispersal huts. A truck rumbled across the field, carrying crates stenciled with American markings, items salvaged from the Thunderbolt's fuselage. As I neared the hangar, I saw activity around it that hadn't been there the previous day. Mechanics stood clustered near the nose, tools in hand, sleeves rolled up. Someone shouted for a fuel line. Another tugged at an uncooperative hose. There was a tension in their movements, purposeful, focused, a little impatient. "Lieutenant," he said, wiping his forehead with the back of his wrist, "we're preparing to run the engine." The words landed with a weight I didn't expect. It shouldn't have surprised me. We all knew the evaluation would eventually require it. But hearing it stated aloud made the aircraft seem suddenly alive, as though the thing in the hangar was no longer just a foreign machine but a creature about to wake up. I stepped inside. Someone had wheeled the Thunderbolt farther into the open space, giving room for exhaust, for airflow, for whatever the Americans had designed that enormous engine to unleash. The cowling was open and the radial engine exposed, a dense forest of cylinders and pipes. A mechanic stood on a ladder leaning into the ignition harnesses, muttering in soft curses as he worked. Another knelt by the belly, checking connections, near the oil cooler. "How long until the start?" I asked. "As soon as we prime the system," the senior mechanic replied. "Fuel has been filtered, oil lines purged. She's ready to wake up." I walked a slow circle around the aircraft, stopping only when I reached the cockpit. The canopy was half open. I rested my hand on the rail, feeling the cold bite of the metal. It was strange, almost unsettling how quickly I'd grown familiar with the weight of this aircraft after only 2 days. There was a murmur behind me. Keller had entered the hangar with 2 engineers in tow. He held a clipboard stuffed with notes. When he reached me, he gave a terse nod. "You'll be seated inside during the start," he said. "We need you to record instrument behavior." "You want me in the cockpit while they test the engine?" I asked. "Where else should the observations come from?" he replied. There was no challenge in his tone, just the simple fact of someone trying to make sense of a machine built by people with different assumptions. I climbed into the cockpit again, this time with a different feeling. The previous visits had been examinations. This one was participation. The crew cleared the area. A mechanic handed up a headset adapted to the American plug. "You'll hear us through intercom," he said. "Say if something smells wrong or if you see a gauge do anything strange." I nodded, then settled into the seat and closed the canopy halfway, leaving a gap so I could still hear the shouts outside. The checklist began. It felt oddly familiar. Pilots everywhere recite similar rituals, but the words the mechanics used were a blend of German procedure and newly invented phrases for American components. Fuel line open, primer cycling, magnetos set. Prop pitch manual range confirmed. A pause, then a shout. Clear left. I braced slightly. The starter whined, a low electric growl that vibrated through the seat. Then, the engine coughed once, a deep, wet sound followed by a second, sharper bark. The radial shook, sputtered, caught, hesitated, and then with a sudden, astonishing violence, it came fully alive. The cockpit trembled. The throttle quadrant buzzed under my hand. The entire nose of the aircraft transformed from cold metal to something that felt like muscle. The sound filled the hangar, dwarfed the men around it, pressed into my chest like a physical weight. German engines had a crisp precision quality, even our radials. This one sounded unbothered, almost indifferent to its own power, not refined, not beautiful, but forceful in a way that bypassed intellect and went straight to instinct. I watched the gauges. Oil pressure rising, temperatures climbing, RPM stabilizing. Nothing out of the ordinary, though. Everything about the sensory experience felt extraordinary. Any vibrations? A voice crackled through the headset. Only the expected ones, I replied. But the amplitude is heavy. Meaning? Meaning you feel the engine first and hear it second. There was some laughter on the other end of the line, nervous, not mocking. The mechanics gestured for a throttle test. I advanced the lever slowly, feeling the resistance. At each centimetre forward, the engine responded with more force than the previous, steady and unhesitating. When we reached the prescribed limit, the hangar felt too small to contain the sound. For a moment I imagined what this power must feel like in the air, with the wind stripping away the excess noise and leaving only the raw pull of acceleration. It must have been like being pushed by an invisible fist. We ran the test for nearly 10 minutes. Temperatures balanced, pressures remained stable, fuel flow smooth. The aircraft had been shot at, crash-landed in a field, dragged across France, packed with new fuel it wasn't meant for, and yet it ran like a workhorse shrugging off a long day. When the engine was finally processed, shut down, the sudden silence was almost jarring. I opened the canopy and climbed out. The mechanics were smiling not out of admiration, but out of the excitement that comes from solving a puzzle. Keller was scribbling furiously on his clipboard. "Thoughts?" he asked without looking up. "It's a factory on wings," I said. "Not a fighter in the way we think of fighters." He paused, finally meeting my eyes. "Explain." I searched for the right words. "Our designs aim for precision, lightness, efficiency, maneuverability. This," I gestured toward the machine as heat shimmered off its cooling engine, "is designed to absorb punishment and still function. It sacrifices elegance for reliability. It trades grace for raw endurance." Keller considered that. "Do you believe it compromises performance?" "The opposite," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my own voice. "It changes the kind of performance that matters." He nodded once, as though that confirmed something he had already begun suspecting. The rest of the day unfolded in a series of incremental tests, electrical responsiveness, trim tab adjustments, a tentative run of the supercharger mechanisms. Each time, the aircraft behaved exactly as the Americans intended: robust, steady, predictable, not agile, not subtle, but unyielding. By evening, I found myself alone with it again. The hangar lights cast long reflections across the smooth skin of the fuselage. I walked alongside it, fingertips grazing the metal without consciously deciding to. A strange familiarity had settled in a quiet acceptance that the machine was no longer foreign. I understood it now, perhaps more than I wanted to. At one point I paused near the cockpit and looked up at it. There was something about the raised seat, the armoured plate behind it, the thick framing of the canopy, a kind of assurance built into its bones. A pilot who flew this would not feel delicate. He would feel secure, protected, encouraged to take risks that our aircraft could not always forgive. And that thought, just that one, left a heaviness in my chest I couldn't shake. I didn't yet realize that tomorrow would bring the true moment of understanding. But the foundation had been laid, the groundwork set. The machine had started to reveal the shape of what it meant. I left the hangar in silence, not bothering to turn off the lights behind me. I had seen enough for one day. The morning came with a sharp wind sweeping across the airfield, carrying with it the kind of cold that stings in the nose and forces the lungs to wake up faster than the mind. I walked toward the hangar with my collar turned up against the chill, boots crunching over the hard ground. A low mist hung just above the grass, giving everything a pale, ghostly outline. The kind of weather that always made me uneasy too much, like the murky air of an early scramble during the bomber raids. When I reached the hangar, the doors were already open. The Thunderbolt was positioned just outside, angled toward a stretch of packed earth that served as our makeshift taxi strip. A mechanic was kneeling near the tailwheel, examining the locking mechanism. Another stood by the propeller, wiping yesterday's oil residue from the cowl flaps. I noticed Keller before anyone else, hands tucked behind his back, posture stiff, eyes fixed on the aircraft as though waiting for it to reveal another secret. When he saw me, he gave a curt nod. "You'll run the taxi trials today," he said. "Both low and medium power?" I asked. "Only what the manual suggests," he replied, though we both knew there was no manual in our possession. "You feel the machine. That is why you're here." The mechanics completed their checks. Someone handed me a leather-lined helmet with the intercom rig already attached. Another passed up a clipboard with a simplified checklist handwritten in neat script. The canopy was open, inviting, though still entirely foreign. I placed my hand on the frame before climbing up an old habit, more ritual than necessity. A part of me expected the metal to feel cold, but it wasn't. The sun had warmed it just enough that the touch felt strangely alive. Settling into the seat, I adjusted the harness straps and scanned the instrument panel again. The gauges were arranged logically, but different enough from German layouts that I still felt a half step behind my own instincts. I let my hand rest lightly on the throttle, feeling the heavy detent near the quadrant's midpoint. The mechanics cleared the area. I signaled readiness. Someone shouted, "Start." The engine coughed once, twice, then roared itself awake with a confidence that made every tool on the workbench clatter. The cockpit trembled. A faint smell of oil and warm metal drifted inward. I watched the needles come alive on the dials, oil pressure rising fast, temperature slow but steady, RPM holding just, below expected idle. Exactly where it had been yesterday. After a moment, I eased the throttle forward. The Thunderbolt didn't respond immediately. Not because it was sluggish, more because it was heavy. Ground handling on a radial aircraft was never elegant, but this was something different. The nose barely dipped as the brakes released. I nudged the rudder pedals. They resisted, requiring more force than a Bf-109 or a Focke-Wulf would ever tolerate. The aircraft wanted room, needed room. It felt like trying to guide a bull by the horns instead of leading a horse by the reins. We rolled forward. The tailwheel chattered over the uneven ground. I compensated with more throttle than I expected to need. The aircraft lumbered, as though needing to be reminded it was allowed to move. A voice came through the headset. "How does she feel?" "Heavy," I answered. "Purposefully heavy." "Meaning?" "Meaning she's stable even when she shouldn't be. The mass smooths out the ground. It wants a straight line, not finesse." I continued the taxi test, bringing the aircraft through a slow turn. I felt the resistance fighting back. Not unpredictably, simply firmly. The kind of firmness that forgives imprecision. A novice pilot could make mistakes in this cockpit, and the aircraft would absorb the error, not amplify it. That realization sank in more heavily than I liked. The next test required a brief burst to higher power. I advanced the throttle past the detent. The engine responded instantly. The nose rose just a fraction. The airframe braced against the surge, and suddenly we were rolling faster than I expected. I tapped the brakes too lightly at first, then more firmly. The response was immediate, controlled, reassuring. The mechanics, watching from the side, nodded to one another. I didn't want to admit the word forming in my mind, but it pressed itself forward all the same. Forgiving. A forgiving fighter was a dangerous fighter. When the sequence ended, I brought the aircraft to a stop and cut the throttle back to idle. The engine rumbled softly, like distant thunder. I let it run another moment, savouring the vibration, then gave the signal for shutdown. As the propeller wound down and the cockpit fell quiet, I sat there for a long breath, staring ahead through the armoured glass. This aircraft was not built for the same war we were fighting. It was built for a war of distance, endurance, predictable systems, and power in reserve. A war of numbers, fuel, and machines that did not require perfect pilots to be effective. When I climbed out, Keller was already waiting. "And?" he asked. "It's built for pilots who don't have time to be perfect," I said. "Give a young man 50 hours in this, and he'll be competent. Give another 50, and he'll be dangerous." Keller studied me for a moment. "Do you think our pilots could adapt to such a design?" "We aren't building machines like this," I replied. "Not because we can't. Because we don't believe in the philosophy." He nodded slowly, and there was a heaviness in his gaze, something unspoken. The engineers gathered around, asking questions, wanting details, pedal responsiveness, ground handling, engine behaviour, under low power. I answered them all, but my mind kept drifting back to a single thought. It wasn't the performance that unsettled me. It was the intent behind the performance. This machine was not made for duelists. It was made for survivors. Hours later, after the aircraft had cooled and the mechanics had wheeled it back inside, I walked the perimeter of the airfield alone. The wind had died down. The mist had lifted. The sun was beginning to set behind the tree line, painting the sky in a soft orange haze. In the distance I saw the silhouettes of our own fighters, BF-100s and 9s lined up like lean predators waiting for prey that no longer flew alone. I stood there for a while, trying to understand the feeling forming deep within my chest. It wasn't admiration, though there were elements of that. It wasn't fear, though something like fear was quietly threaded through it. It was recognition. Recognition that the war we had prepared ourselves for was no longer the war we were fighting. And the Thunderbolt, sitting quietly in its hangar with metal cooling under the evening air, had just made that truth impossible to ignore. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.